Some There you go. You hit the record button. So again, thank you, Yvette, for inviting me. My name is Evan Weiner. I've been doing this type of thing since 1971. It's at Spring Valley High School in Rockland County, New York. I was in 11th grade, and a guy by the name of Joe Dionisio, who I still am in contact with. He lives in Arkansas now. Said, you got a good voice, student. How would you like to be on radio? And I was. I was on the high school radio show on WRKL Radio, 910 on the dial, and Joe opened the door up for me to work for the Bergen Record and the Nyack Journal News, and I ended up working for WNEW as well later on in life. I worked with that guy in the middle, John Madden, and we worked together for about 15 years on a syndicated radio show. That's Dennis Steele on the right, John in the middle, and me on the left. And I'll start off with this quick story about John not being able to get satisfaction, or can't get no satisfaction. John is in Chicago. They're at the Drake Hotel, and this is a story that Michael Frank told me about John. And Michael was his right-hand man, and he drove him around before Willie and the bus and all that. And they get to the Drake Hotel in Chicago, and they check in. They go to the elevator, and they're going up to their room, and there's this short little English guy in there who says, Mr. Madden, I just want to shake your hand. You're the greatest. I'm an English guy. I don't know anything about football, but I watch you all the time, and you've taught me so much about football, and it's great. And then he gets out of the elevator, and Michael, Frank, and John are talking, and John said, hey, you know who that guy is? He says, yeah, that's Mick Jagger. Who? Mick Jagger. Mick who? Mick Jagger, you know. Yeah, I can't get no satisfaction. And John says, he looks like he can't get no satisfaction. And years later, of course, the Rolling Stones did the opening for the Monday Night Football game that John was doing. Football, it just grew. There was no game plan. There was no business plan. There was nothing. It just became America's most popular sport. And I've written, and this is available on ebook, America's Passion, how a coal miner's game became the NFL in the 20th century. And poor Benny Feathers there played with the Brooklyn Dodgers. He's a running back. A little unnecessary roughness in bringing him down if you look where that right hand is. And look at the referee. He looks like he's about ready to go out golfing. That was Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Dodgers playing the Pittsburgh Steelers in Pittsburgh. It was a coal miner's game to begin with, from the mom and pop store operations to the multi-billion-dollar business of today, and $10 billion or $12 billion they're going to get from their latest TV deal. The roots are in Western Pennsylvania in the coal mines. But football really started, a form of football, in New Jersey. 1869 with Princeton playing Rutgers in college football. Rutgers and Princeton, November 6th, 1869, over in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and Rutgers won that game 6-4. If you watch the game, from what I've read, since I haven't been able to talk to anybody since that game was played 152 years ago, it wasn't anything like the game today. There were two teams on the field. They had 25 men each, all on the field. They're playing rugby-like rules. The teams lined up with two members of each team remaining more or less stationary near the opponent's goal, hopes of being able to slip over and score from an unguarded position. The other 23 players were per team, 46 actually, were divided into groups of 11 and 12. There were 11 fielders lined up in their own territory as defenders. 12 Bulldogs carried the battle. For the next 7 years, there were no rules. The first rules, written by a guy by the name of Walter Camp, and every year in New Haven, well, maybe not this year because of COVID, but every year in New Haven in February, there's the Walter Camp All-American dinner. I've gone to those in the past, and Walter Camp was the Yale coach, and he wrote the first rules for American football. And Walter Camp would be around for a very key meeting decades later. This guy, Pudge Heffelfinger, was the first guy who got paid, that we know of, to play football. The Allegheny Athletic Association, also known as AAA, AAA, and the Pittsburgh Athletic Club were supposed to play football against one another. And the former Yale All-American guard, Pudge Heffingfinger, was paid $500 by the AAA to play in the first game against the Pack team from Pittsburgh. He became the first player ever to be paid for playing football. $500 in 1892 probably now is about $75,000, $80,000. And this guy, he's 16 years old. His name is John Bralier, and he becomes the first openly pro football player, 16. He takes $10 plus expenses to pay for Latrobe, the Latrobe YMCA against the Jeannette Athletic Club. The AAA, the Allegheny Athletic Association, had a completely professional team in 1896 for its two-game season. And there is the Latrobe football team in 1897, and one guy with a bowler there hat, probably the coach, and they're ready to go and play football. Latrobe Athletic Association football team became the first professional team to play a full season with only professionals in 1897. Philadelphia's first team was in 1899. The Frankford Athletic Association was organized May of 1899, and this was fans who owned it, sort of like Green Bay in a way, but not. If you wanted to join their team, it was $10, but also you could pay $1 or $2.50 to be part of this team. And in keeping with the charter, all profits would be donated to a local charity. All of the team's excess income was donated to local charitable institutions. The original Frankfurt Athletic Association team disbanded prior to 1909 season. The National Football League's oldest team is the Arizona Cardinals, and they started in Chicago as the Morgan Athletic Club in 1899. They were a neighborhood team, and it was on the south side of Chicago. I don't know, bad Leroy Brown was there, but they were football players. The team later would become known as the Normals, then the Racine, not Wisconsin, the Racine, named after a street, Chicago Cardinals, and then the Chicago Cardinals. The team would relocate to St. Louis, thanks to CBS putting up $500,000 to move the grandstands from Chicago's Comiskey Park to Sportsman's Park in St. Louis, even though they had grandstands. CBS just wanted to open up the market so they could show Chicago Bear games 6 times a year. In 1988, the owner, Bill Bidwell, moved the team to Tempe, Arizona. It was named the Phoenix Cardinals. In 1994, the team was renamed the Arizona Cardinals. It is the oldest continuing football operation. There was a league in Chicago, 1902. It was called the Chicago Football League. And the Cardinals were the champions, that team of the Chicago Football League. The 20th century, baseball players turned football players. Philadelphia Athletics and the Philadelphia Phillies had professional football teams, and they joined the Pittsburgh Stars, trying to put together a pro league. And that was the first pro league called the National Football League, even though all 3 teams were, they should have called it the Keystone Football League in the Keystone State, Pennsylvania. The Chicago Football League was formed several local clubs, the Chicago Tigers and some outside Chicago teams, Hammond, Indiana, which isn't very far from Chicago, Rockford, Decatur, Racine, Illinois, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And there was also an Ohio League, and there was a New York State League. And in 1904, Ohio had at least 7 pro teams. Massillon won the professional title, the Ohio Independent Championship. Massillon to this day has a powerhouse football team. It's a high school football team in Massillon, Ohio. Theodore Roosevelt is credited with saving football. He's credited with saving football, at least college football. And there's some merit to the story, but probably not all as much as the Roosevelt writers want you to believe. But here's the deal. Theodore Roosevelt did force college football to change its rules because there were 40 players who died on the field in 1904 and 1905. Roosevelt threatened to ban football in America unless rules were implemented to make the game safer. The reported 40 players, just on the college level. We don't know how many players may have died in Ohio or New York or the Chicago League from injuries suffered on the football field over a 2-year period in 04 and 05. But nobody could actually really figure out what Roosevelt could do. He just couldn't ban the game. I mean, he doesn't have that in his power. And besides, if he bans the game, who's going to enforce the ban? But people took him seriously, and there were changes. Walter Camp was there in the playing rules to make it safer. And this is 29 years after Walter Camp put together the rules of football. Eventually, the initiative would lead to the formation of the NCAA. Theodore Roosevelt would bring in the presidents of Harvard, Yale, and Princeton to the Oval Office, bang their heads together, fix the game or else. A couple things are going on here. Roosevelt had an absolute hatred of the Harvard president, Charles Eliot. Roosevelt went there, hated Charles Eliot. And the Harvard contingent wanted to change football. And Roosevelt had this natural hatred of Eliot, and he wasn't going to do what Eliot wanted. Walter Camp wrote the original rules of football. He's over at Yale. He wants to keep it as is, and Princeton is kind of on the fence. Now, if you picked up newspapers back in those days when they had cartoons, you might see a cartoon like this. There's a guy ready to snap the ball, and he's got a shawl over him that says death, and behind him there's the carnage of football. Players dead on the field. And it's the 12th man, that's what it's called, the 12th player in every football game, the chance of death. Also, take a look at that football. The football is more watermelon-shaped size than it is today. Roosevelt, I demand that football changes its rules or be abolished. Change the game or forsake it. I told you about his hatred of Eliot. He also had a couple other things going for him. First of all, Roosevelt was a rugged outdoorsman. He thought it gave life, gave him vigor and vim. Also, his son played football, also at Harvard. And he suffered major injuries in high school and college. Made him a lot tougher, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. And there was one other thing. He has a soft spot for the game. Because, you know, he goes up that San Juan Hill. He's the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1898. You got the Spanish-American War, and it's Puerto Rico, and it's Cuba, and he goes to Cuba, and they go up San Juan Hill. And some of those guys that he signed up with or signed up to be with the Rough Riders listed their occupations as professional football players in 1898, so he has a soft spot for them. So they go to the White House, they meet, they decide, okay, all right, I'm not going to ban the game, but on the other hand, you better do something. And they did. 1906, there were plays designed to open up the game, make it so-called less dangerous to play, although, again, the NFL and the concussion issue is in the news. Because of some stuff that lawyers introduced that may not have been what should have been there in their settlement in the concussion issue. But anyway, they thought they made the game less dangerous to play. And it would be the last time the White House would be involved with football in terms of injuries until about 2014. The committee passed legislation that led to the introduction of the forward pass. Before, they used to pick up players and just flip them because it was first down and 5. Now it's first down and 10. And all mass formation and gang tackling were banned. And that should have saved football or saved players from getting killed. There were players over the years that did get killed, but it was supposed to make the game safer. On the pro level, there's Jim Thorpe, perhaps the greatest athlete of the 20th century, and he's with the Canton Bulldogs in the mid-19 teens. Thorpe and the Canton Bulldogs, we're beginning to see the beginning of some professionalism, real professionalism in football. In 1915, Jack Cusack signs Jim Thorpe to a contract to play in Canton, and the team's name is going to be the Canton Bulldogs. 1916, Thorpe and the former Carlisle, or his former Carlisle teammate, Pete Kellick, are on the team. Canton goes 9-0-1. They win the Ohio League Championship, and they were claimed to be the champion of pro football. A lot of these leagues, and they thought, well, that was the best there. Meanwhile, up in Green Bay, there's a guy by the name of Curly Lambeau. Curly Lambeau, of course, Lambeau Field in Green Bay. And he's trying to put together a team in Green Bay, and he organizes that team in 1919. And he doesn't know from marketing. He has no idea about marketing. There was no such thing as sports marketing in 1919. But he cuts a deal with his employer, the Indian Packing Company, meat packing company. And they say, okay, we'll buy the equipment for the team, $500, and you could use the company field for practices. And this is the first naming rights deal ever done. They become the Green Bay Packers. Lambeau had no idea what he was doing. I mean, today you got naming rights deals for the Islanders, as a matter of fact. It's like $15 million a year they're getting from a bank for the new arena at Belmont. And the Jets-Giants deal is like $20 million a year at the Meadowlands from the insurance company. And he gets $500 so he can get his team off the ground. The NFL is coming, and these guys who are running football teams want to become more professional. There are a lot of leagues going around, and there are players going from team to team to team to team to team, and these guys who are running football, they don't want that at all. The NFL is coming by 1920, but not quite yet. This is the Akron Pros. That's their name, the Akron Pros, the Akron Professionals. They win the 1920, or claim they win the 1920 football championship. And there's a guy down on the bottom, the last guy at the end of the row, a guy by the name of Fritz Pollard. Fritz Pollard would become the first African-American coach of a major league team in 1921 in Akron. There was a feeling among owners that they were losing too much money. They were paying $10 a game, $15 a game. That's all they were doing. I met a guy in Riverdale many, many years ago. I was giving a talk in Riverdale. He was a tall guy. He was about in his 80s, and he was in really good shape. And we got to talking. And he said, well, I played in the National Football League in 1928. I said, well, that's cool. How much did you get per game? He said, maybe $5, $10 a game. They weren't paying much money, but there were too many leagues, and there were the football owners, and they really weren't owners. They were the coach, and they were the ones who got the money together and set everything up. Wanted to stop the quote-unquote dramatically rising salaries. Players jump from team to team, following the highest offer. And also college players played college on Saturday and played in the NFL or some other league the next day. In 1920, it all starts with the American Professional Football Conference and the Akron Pros and the Canton Bulldogs and the Cleveland Indians and the Dayton Triangles are in Canton, Ohio, and they form this league. And then there's a second meeting, and they get guys from Indiana and New York and Illinois, and they change the name to the American Professional Football Association. It would become the NFL. The Chicago Bears, that team starts as the Decatur Staleys, and this is another example of these guys not knowing what they're doing and yet striking pay dirt, because George Halas, who, by the way, was the last regular New York Yankee right fielder back in 1919 before some guy by the name, I don't know if you ever heard of him, George Herman Ruth, they called him Babe. He took over from Halas as the right fielder with the Yankees. And the Staleys, that was Halas's team. But before I get into that, look over at the left of Halas, left of the screen. It's to Halas's right, left of the screen. The last guy in the first row on the left side was named George Trafton. And I was talking to the late John Bankert about 20 years ago. He ran Pro Football's Hall of Fame. And he was telling me stories about guys playing on college football on Saturday and going into the NFL the next day. And he says that there's this old story that he had heard about some guy playing college football against Trafton. The next day, they're playing each other in an NFL game. And the guy is looking down, and Trafton was a center, and he's missing his index finger. And the guy says to him, "Hey, didn't I play against you yesterday?" And in those days, they had shields on the face just with the eyes cut out to hide identities. They were hiding identities like it mattered, but that's what they were doing. And he says, "No, I've never seen you before." He said, "That's strange." He said, "There was a guy just like you yesterday, just like you. He didn't have an index finger either." And I got to thinking, you must be the same guy. It wasn't me. It wasn't me. It wasn't me. Those things happened all the time back in those days. The Chicago Bears, their first year, 1921. A.E. Staley turned the Decatur Staleys over to the player coach, George Halas, who moves the team to Cubs Park, which is now known as Wrigley Field, in Chicago. Staley paid Halas $5,000 to keep the name Staley's for one more year, a marketing deal. They didn't think of it in those days like that. Halas would make his halfback, Ed Dutch Sturman, his partner. And there's Fritz Pollard. Fritz Pollard was the first African-American coach of any major league team, whether it was, would only be at that point, the NFL and Major League Baseball, and discounting the Negro baseball leagues at this point. But in terms of the major leagues and the National Hockey League, it just started as well. Fritz Pollard immediately earned a place in pro football history, one of two African Americans in the new league. And in 1921, he became the head coach. He was named the co-coach, but he was the head coach of the Akron Pros. And he would be in the league until he wasn't in the league. The NFL put a ban on black players after the 1932 season. There was never anything officially put in writing, but there were no NFL players who were black between 1933 and 1945. And Pollard, who went to Brown University, talked about what happened in the early days. It was evident in my first year at Akron back in 1919, they didn't want blacks in there getting any money. And here I was playing and coaching and pulling down the highest salary in pro football. He would eventually be out of pro football rather soon. And there is a Fritz Pollard Society today, or alliance, that tries to screen minority candidates and head them over to NFL teams to hire them for coaches. There is Curly Lambeau's Green Bay Packers back in 1922, and they had to leave the APFA or the NFL because they were caught using players who had college eligibility remaining during the 1921 season. So they had to get back into the league somehow, and Curly Lambeau reached into his pocket and paid $50 to buy the franchise back. And then he went broke. So local merchants said, "Hey, we like our football team here. You know what? Here's $2,500. Finish the season." And then a public nonprofit corporation was set up to operate the team. This is in 1922. 99 years later, the Green Bay Packers football team continues to be a public nonprofit corporation. People do buy stock in the team, but they're buying it so they can hang the stock certificate on their wall because it's worthless. It's absolutely worthless. But the money that they got, the money they get from TV now and from ticket sales and all that, keeps them going. And actually, they turned a profit a couple of years ago because they're the only team that had to report, because it's a public company, what their bottom line is. And they made a profit a couple of years ago. It seems inconceivable that any NFL team can lose money. But that was the only way of keeping Green Bay in the league, and Green Bay is an anomaly. You're not going to see that ever happening again, whether it's Major League Baseball, National Football League, National Hockey League, the Major League Soccer, or the National Basketball Association. It's just not going to happen. And so Green Bay survives. But the whole league may not have survived without this guy, Red Grange. It's 1925, college eligibility. Well, Grange couldn't help. He was well known. He was up there with Jack Dempsey and Babe Ruth and Rudolph Valentino and Al Jolson back in those days. The Galloping Ghost played at Illinois, University of Illinois. And, he had name recognition. He had an agent, too, Cash and Carry Pyle, C.C. Pyle, Cash and Carry Pyle. Late in the 1925 season, in the NFL season, the University of Illinois, their football season was over. And George Halas decided, you know what? I'm going to go sign Red Grange. Now, he wasn't supposed to. His college eligibility wasn't up. Turns out to be a brilliant signing because it professionalizes the National Football League in a way. Grange got big money, got a share of revenue. Wherever he went, the Bears went. Whenever they played, he got a piece of the house. The Grange signing violated NFL rules, but there really weren't any NFL rules. They sort of had rules, but they didn't. Against signing players before they completed their college eligibility. Not that it really mattered. They just wanted them to play more games. But signing of Red Grange and the subsequent national barnstorming tour the Bears took in 1925 more than likely saved the NFL from oblivion. At least one team saved from oblivion. That would be the New York Giants. Red Grange would come into New York at the Polo Grounds. You get 77,000 people there. Tim Mara counts the money. It saves the New York Giants because they were losing money. And Mara, who was a bootlegger and also ran numbers, was able to continue his team. So the Grange signing clearly violated NFL rules against signing players before they completed the college eligibility. But there was that tour, and there was the subsequent publicity, and it was great. On Thanksgiving Day, crowd 36,000 people. 36,000 people, largest crowd ever to see a pro football game, watched Red Grange and the Bears play the Chicago Cardinals. There was an 8-game, 12-day barnstorming tour. St. Louis, Philadelphia, New York, Washington, Boston, Pittsburgh, Detroit, back to Chicago. And that makes pro football and the NFL. Saves the Giants franchise. The Giants should have number 77 in their ring of honor because of Red Grange, because without Red Grange, there may not have been a Giants franchise. 73,000 people pack the Polo Grounds, and Tim Mara gets to put all that money in his pocket. A couple of weeks later, the Bears go out to Los Angeles to play the Los Angeles Tigers. 75,000 people, all because of Red Grange. But the NFL screwed over Red Grange. He wanted a team in New York to play at Yankee Stadium, and they wouldn't let him. They were protecting Tim Mara. Now, was the Pottstown Maroons, the 1925 NFL champions? Well, maybe. Let's talk about that. The Pottsville Maroons, about 90 miles from Philadelphia, a legendary team, played as a member of the National Football League from 1925 to 1928. The 1925 Maroons compiled a record widely viewed as the league's best. They ended their season, or climaxed their season, by defeating Notre Dame in a well-publicized pro versus college match in Philadelphia. But then they were denied the NFL championship in a controversial league decision. Despite strong regional support, the franchise moved to Boston in 1929. The disputed championship, December 6, 1925. NFL is still a minor league, any way you cut it, even with Red Grange running around. Pottsville Maroons beat the Chicago Cardinals in what was considered to be the 1925 NFL championship game. The Maroons had a 9-2 record. Chicago Cardinals 9-1-1 heading into the showdown game with the Maroons. NFL didn't have an official championship game in those days. Can you imagine that? Hey, we don't have the Super Bowl. No Super Bowl. Despite finishing the 1925 season with the best record, because they beat the Cardinals, Pottsville was not awarded a league title. They beat Chicago, and they wanted to play one more game. They could make a lot of money playing former Notre Dame college stars. And the game is played in Shibe Park in Philadelphia. But the Philadelphia territory is, the Philadelphia territory is assigned to Frankford, PA, Yellow Jackets, and they say to the NFL, hey, you can't have them here. Frankford claimed that Pottsville was violating the territorial rights in drawing fans away from a Frankfurt game, which was played the same day. The league president, Joe Carr, said, yeah, Frankfurt, you're right. Prior to the Pottsville Notre Dame game, Carr told the Maroons 3 times, don't play the game. He fined the team $500, suspended the team's right to the championship, and revoked the Pottsville NFL franchise. This is the NFL back then. Meanwhile, the Chicago Cardinals owner, a guy by the name of Chris O'Brien, said that we're not taking this title because we didn't win it on the field. Officially, the 1925 championship is given to the Chicago Cardinals. Meanwhile, Grange forms the American Football League because the National Football League wouldn't give them a franchise in New York. The Los Angeles Wildcats begin with the 1926 formation of the American Football League, which was backed by C.C. Pyle, who was a sports agent, and his client was Red Grange. And he got a 5-year lease at Yankee Stadium. And then, not going into the NFL, well, AFL, Red Grange is he's a drawing card showcase for his client. The LA team would be a road team. The first LA team was the Los Angeles Buccaneers, but they never played in Los Angeles. They played in Chicago. They were made up of people from California, primarily University of California and University of Southern California alumni. One guy who's not on that team was a guy by the name of Marion Morrison, because he was kicked off USC's team, and you probably know him better as John Wayne. The Buccaneers did play 2 true home games in Los Angeles, both of them exhibition games against the AFL's New York Yankees in January 1927. The Buccaneers also played 2 games in San Francisco, including the last game of the Buccaneers' existence, an exhibition game against the AFL's Los Angeles Wildcats. Football salaries, well, they claim, now this guy told me he got $10 a game, the guy from Riverdale, 75 to $100 a game. The average ticket price, less than $1. 15 players per team. Revenues through paid attendance and concessions. The standard game contract provided for guaranteed payment to the visiting team, about $1,000 in the early 1920s, against 40% of the gate receipts after deducting 15% for rental and maintenance of the field. Now, the Chicago Bears and the Green Bay Packers are hated rivals. Absolute hated rivals. Just ask anybody in Chicago. Just ask anybody in Wisconsin. But there's more to that than that. Curly Lambeau and George Halas needed one another. Actually needed one another. The Depression hits. The NFL is down to 10 teams, then 8 teams. Lowest in NFL history, 1932. Chicago Bears. Halas can't make his payroll. And he gets a hold of his friend Curly Lambeau in Green Bay and says, I need money. Green Bay Packers, community-owned team, stocks and all that. They provide George Halas with $1,500 so George Halas could meet his payroll. Without Green Bay, it is quite possible Chicago Bears would not have existed past 1932. The Frankford Yellow Jackets also did not last very long during the Depression. They would move to Philadelphia. They joined the NFL in 1924, but they could only play games on Saturdays, which means they couldn't get the college guys because of blue laws. The Yellow Jackets won the 26th NFL championship, but before the start of the 31 season, the Frankfurt Stadium was severely damaged by a fire. The club had to go somewhere else to play their games. They played in the Philadelphia Municipal Stadium, which became JFK Stadium, and the Baker Bowl. The team thought that it could become the Philadelphia team, but they didn't. They folded. And the Philadelphia Eagles entered the league in 1933. You got to be a football hero, and some of football's popularity was based on cartoons and movies. Early Hollywood movies were based on college football. Horse Feathers, one of my favorite Marx Brothers movie. In fact, when I do politics, sports, business talk at colleges, I recommend to the professor, show Horse Feathers. It lampoons college sports. Quincy Adams Wagstaff is the new president of Huxley University, and he's looking for football players. So he goes down to a bar looking to get two guys to suit up for his team, Huxley. And instead, he signs up Baravelli and Pinky, Chico and Harpo. The big game is against the rival Darwin. Mickey Mouse and Popeye, two football cartoons there. Oh, and there was songs by Al Sherman and Buddy Fields and Al Lewis. You got to be a football hero to get along with the beautiful girls. And, well, they're football heroes. Zeppo, Groucho, Harpo, and Chico, football heroes. Touchdown, there's Mickey. He's scoring a touchdown. Oh, you got to be a football hero because you want to get olive oil. And look at Brutus and look at Popeye, both fighting over the affection of olive oil. Professionalism comes to football around 1934 because of this guy. His name, G.A. Richards. He is the owner of WJR Radio in Detroit, and he buys a football team. He buys a team and moves them to Detroit, and the reason he buys a football team is he wants to fill up programming, and what better way to fill up Sunday than have a football team. In 1934, because of G.A. Richards, football discovers, hey, wait a minute, we could sell the rights for broadcast to Mutual Radio, NBC, and make some money off of it. That's what Richards got them to do. And within 6 years, the NFL's on TV and bringing in television money. The league is still a mom and pop store at this point. There's the second incarnation of the American Football League, AFL2, becomes a rival to the NFL in 1936. At that point, the NFL had 9 teams, played in the biggest population centers in the country. The AFL decides to compete directly with the NFL in many of these cities. The AFL would fold after a year or two, but the NFL liked the Cleveland market and went back in there after failures by a whole bunch of other Cleveland teams. The point spread is incredibly important to the growth of football. Gambling, betting and gambling, that's the big deal. Incredibly, incredibly important. And this guy who taught John Kennedy at high school over in Riverdale, when Kennedy was living in Bronxville. He spent most of his life in Bronxville, about 0.8 of a mile from where I live right now. He didn't grow up in Massachusetts, grew up in Bronxville. Charles McNeil was a compulsive gambler, and all of the leagues need to enshrine him in their Hall of Fames as a builder. In the 1930s, he may have invented the point spread, which made the outcome of football games more interesting than just the final score of bettors. It's not known if McNeil came up with the idea or borrowed it, but he definitely refined it and opened up a new, albeit illegal, industry. People bet on scores, not which team won. And that created a lot of interest in football. World War II comes along, and the NFL is struggling. Major League Baseball got to go ahead to play from Franklin Roosevelt. It was called the Green Light letter. It was sent to Kennesaw Mountain Landis in 1942, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. The baseball commissioner Landis said to Franklin Roosevelt in the letter, what are we supposed to do? And Roosevelt said, play. Dan Rooney, the late Dan Rooney, who is the Pittsburgh Steelers owner, told me that with that letter going out to baseball, that yes, we would play football, the NFL, in 42, 43, 44 as the war went on. But Rooney had a problem because most of the teams that did play, the reason they were able to play was that they were near Army or Navy bases, and there was nothing of that sort in Pittsburgh. So Pittsburgh combined with the Philadelphia Eagles, a team called the Steagles in 1943, and then with Chicago, with the Cardinals, because that was the Navy stations were over Lake Michigan, and they were known as Carpet. And had the war continued in 1945, they would have aligned with the Brooklyn team in 1945. Surviving as a league, the teams survived by recruiting retired players or using college players. Teams located near Army and Navy bases could use players stationed near their cities. Pittsburgh was a problem. No nearby military bases. Art Rooney in 1943 merged his team with Philadelphia, and also in 1944 in Chicago. There was a new league after the war. It was called the All-American Football Conference, and they break the color barrier. The NFL, post-World War II, still a mom-and-pop operation, but they get some competition from the new All-American Football Conference. Black players would return to NFL rosters in 1946. It's a typo, 1946, after sitting out for 12 years, from 34 to 45. The NFL would come to Los Angeles in 1946, but it wasn't easy. And that guy in front of Kirk Douglas helped get the Los Angeles Coliseum Commission, the Cleveland Rams, to move out to Los Angeles. Woody Strode. Daniel Reeves moves his Cleveland Rams to Los Angeles in 1946, but there's a problem. He wants to go out there, and the Los Angeles Coliseum was built by federal money in an effort to attract an Olympics, which they did in 1932. And because of that, there was equal opportunity employment. And they told Daniel Reeves that he absolutely had to abide by the EOE, equal opportunity employment. The National Football League wasn't very happy about that and threatened to stop Reeves from moving. But Reeves would move, and the National Football League would eventually accept Negro players, and between 1946 and the 1960s, there was a quota on Negro players, 4 per team. No quarterback, no center, no middle linebacker, because those positions needed people with intelligence, and the thought was that Negro players were not intelligent enough to be a center, quarterback, or middle linebacker. All-American Football Conference. The San Francisco 49ers started play in the All-American Football Conference 1946. That team joined the NFL in 1950, as did the Baltimore Colts and the Cleveland Browns. Breaking the color barrier. The Cleveland Rams owner, Daniel Reeves, would sign Kenny Washington and Woody Strode. There was that color barrier between 33 and 45. The new league, the All-American Football Conference, there's no color barrier. There is Paul Brown with Marion Motley, who he signed in 1946 for the Cleveland Browns. I went to talk to Paul about that years ago, and he said, hey, I don't care, white, black, green, yellow, red. If they can play football, they're on my team. Except when the team, the Cleveland Browns, went to Miami to play the Miami Seahawks in 1946, Marion Motley was left behind along with Bill Willis because they had death threats in Miami. They endured taunts and racial slurs and dirty play from opponents on the field. But on the Cleveland Browns, Bill Willis and Marion Motley were welcome. Admiral TV. I don't know how many of you remember Admiral TV. That was an old TV, the old black and whites. They signed a deal with the Los Angeles Rams to televise all of the games locally in Los Angeles, simply because they thought they wanted to sell TVs, and there were enough people who were interested in seeing the Los Angeles Rams that they would go out and buy a TV. Well, yeah, that happened. People bought TVs, but they decided, hey, if we could see the home games at home, why go to the stadium? And that would start something in 1951 called the blackout. 1949, 300,000 fans went to home games. In 1950, the attendance dropped by half. Bert Bell told the teams, don't televise your home games. And the blackout rule, which is still debated in Washington, begins in 1951. It's upheld by a judge in 1953 by the name of Alan Grimm, who said that the NFL did not break any antitrust laws. It was a semi-pro operation into the 1950s. That's Stan Jones, who played with the Chicago Bears. And the NFL had 13 teams in 1950. And I talked to Stan Jones about 1950s football, and he said, hey, this is semi-pro league. He was a lineman with the Chicago Bears, offensive lineman. Season would be done in December, and then he had to get another job. And this is what he told me. We weren't a full-time operation. A lot of people don't realize that. The football teams closed up after the last game of the year, packed everything away, and George Halas wasn't a full-time football man himself. Most of the players weren't paid during the 8 weeks of training camp in the 1950s. In fact, players didn't even have their own equipment except for shoes, which became a hot commodity because guys who were cut from the team, the veterans, would buy the shoes and then sell them to the incoming guys so they would have beer money. The team shared all the other equipment. If you're an old New York Giants fan, Andy Robustelli ended up with the Giants after being with the Los Angeles Rams because he told Daniel Reeves, I can't play anymore. I can't be out here getting no pay for 8 weeks and then play a 12-game season and then maybe a championship game. I can't be away from my business 21 weeks a year. And so he's traded to the Giants because he's got a couple businesses up in Stanford. Bert Bell was the Eagles founder and the NFL commissioner at the time. Frank Tripucka was not very impressed with the NFL. Used to go to his house over in New Jersey. And he talked about, well, this is what he said. A lot of the people, this is the 1950s, a lot of people think even in those days that the National Football League was the almighty league, but it really wasn't. The National Football League in those days was haphazard. Canada competed for players in 1953. Here's Tripucka, who's playing with the Baltimore franchise, and he says, I was totally disenchanted with football, so I came back here to Bloomfield, New Jersey to call it quits. I get a call from Saskatchewan, and the fellow says, what would it take you to come up here and play? I'm making a big $12,000 at that time, so I hurriedly said $25,000. They said, you got it. That was the year they opened up the Canadian Football League to 8 Americans. Prior to that, they only had 3 Americans on each team. And a lot of Americans went up there, and all of a sudden, after 1956, it ended. Nobody seems to know why it ended. It just ended. Whether the NFL owner said something or didn't say something, it just ended. George Halas was running the league in the 1950s out of Chicago. And Tripucka said he was the founder, and he pretty much ran that league. Tripucka was with the Chicago Cardinals for a while. Many a time we used to kid on the field, on the sideline, and the referee would reach into his pocket and first look over at the sideline to see to George Halas. If Halas didn't give him any sign, he'd throw the flag. If Halas shook his head no, he wouldn't throw the flag. And that is the Chicago Cardinals football team that Tripucka was once on. And the Cardinals and the Bears were, well, they were blacking out home games, and the league upheld it, and no games were seen in Chicago. That was what the NFL was like in 1956. 12 teams. And Halas and Rooney and Mara and some of the others say, you know, maybe we should expand this out. And maybe in 5 years we'll do it. You know, we'll see. Maybe Houston's good. Maybe Dallas is good. Chicago Cardinals, maybe they'll move to Houston or Dallas. Chicago was playing 2 games a year, either in Minneapolis or Buffalo, to open up the Chicago market so games could be seen on TV. More than games seen on TV in Chicago. The NFL's 1958 championship game would change football. That was when the Colts beat the Giants 23-17 in overtime. And Johnny Unitas was the field general that led the Colts down the field. The American Football League would start in 1959. Chicago, 2 teams that caused TV problems. Like I said, Chicago played 2 games in other markets. Lamar Hunt and Bud Adams each tried to buy the team. Hunt wanted to move the team to Dallas, Adams to Houston. They failed. They struck out, so they said, okay, we're going to start our own football league, the American Football League, and that would jolt football. The Bidwell family would move to St. Louis because Bill Paley at CBS, the chairman of the board for CBS, founder of CBS in 1927, WCAU radio in Philadelphia, throws in $500,000. The $500,000 was easily made back in advertising now that 6 Chicago Bears games were on in Chicago. Chicago could finally see their home teams. Green Bay needed a stadium, and Halas is there helping out. The Chicago Bears owner and coach went to small Wisconsin towns in the offseason to pay back the debt that Curly Lambeau helped him out back in the Depression, and he helps raise money so that the Green Bay Packers would have enough funds for year to year. Those fundraisers would take place in the 1950s, and with some of that money, they would build a stadium. By the 1950s, the Green Bay Stadium was too small, too inadequate, even after they expanded it. Halas gives the Green Bay Packers board of directors an ultimatum. You build a new stadium or you go into Milwaukee where there was a new stadium full time. The residents of Green Bay said, yep, we'll approve a bond issue and we'll build a new stadium, city stadium. Milwaukee actually put up, first city to put up money for a stadium expressly for baseball and football back in 1950. Green Bay just followed suit 6 years later. And the old city stadium becomes a high school field as there is a new city stadium. The greatest game ever played, 1958, December 28th. And the Giants lose to the Colts, but Lamar Hunt is watching that game and says, you know what? I can't join the NFL. We're going to form a new league, which becomes the American Football League. Sam Huff, who unfortunately is suffering from dementia now. I like Sam Huff. I've known Sam for a long, long time. Last time I spoke to him was about 3 years ago, and can't really do it anymore. NFL goes mainstream after that game. Again, Time Magazine, Pro Football, Bronze, Brains, and Profits. Sam Huff is on the cover of Time Magazine. Rozelle and the Joke. There I am with Pete Rozelle in 1986. That's the USFL NFL antitrust trial. Somebody must have said something funny because Pete's smiling and I'm laughing at his Fortune magazine from 1986. The swinging 60s. Pro football has entirely changed between 58 and 66. Rozelle becomes commissioner in 1960. The Continental Baseball League, of all things, has a major impact. Branch Rickey is out of baseball, and he's asked by people to form a new baseball league with the thought of becoming a major league by 1963. So he's going from place to place to place to place, talking to these people about making a commitment to the Continental Baseball League. One person he sees, Lamar Hunt. And he gives Lamar Hunt the pitch, doesn't want it. But Lamar Hunt co-opts Branch Rickey's thought for a baseball league, revenue sharing, television sharing, revenue, all this other stuff, and it becomes the AFL. Television would become very important in the 1960s. Congress and President Kennedy's impact on the NFL with the Sports Broadcast Act of 1961, which meant the NFL could take all of its then 14 teams as one, present a package, and have CBS and NBC bid on it. Those were the two major networks in those days, and CBS would win. In 1965, David Sarnoff over at NBC loses the NFL package, or a chance to get the NFL package, calls Sonny Werblin, the owner of the Jets at that point, said, how much money did they get? Well, here's $35 million. Build yourself a league. With that money, Sonny Werblin signs Joe Namath and others. There's a bidding war for players. All the owners say, hey, can't do this anymore, and they decide to merge. But it's not as easy said as done. They had to go through Congress, and the formation of the New Orleans Saints is directly tied to the 1966 merger because Russell Long in the Senate and Hale Boggs in Congress traded their no votes in exchange for a team in New Orleans. They become yes, and New Orleans has a team. The game changer is Pete Gogolak, the Buffalo Bills kicker who signs a deal with the New York Giants. The NFL and the Giants called, said, Gogolak, I signed with the Giants and made 3 times as much as I made with the Bills. I signed for $35,000. They gave me a 4-year no-cut contract. I went to the Giants. The team wasn't as good as the Bills. And you know what happened? The AFL started calling NFL players. The war started, and basically a few months later, the two leagues merged. So maybe I started something. Not only started the soccer-style kick, but maybe I started the merger. And there is my old buddy Pete, who actually taught me a lot about the business of sports after the merger. Joe Namath makes the Super Bowl important. Super Bowl I and Super Bowl II have minimal impact, But on January 12th, 1969, Namath and the Jets beat Baltimore. Validation of the careers of AFL players in the AFL, and that leads football into a new territory with the Super Bowl leading the way. All the money flows in, and there's me and my buddy Bruce Morton from ABC. He's in Denver now, speaking to Joe in 1988 about how he changed football, and he's in the Hall of Fame for one game. He beat the Baltimore Colts. He validated the American Football League. That is why he's in the Hall of Fame. And there's Monday Night Football with my old friend Howard Cosell. I'm still friendly with his grandson, Justin, who's a charter school principal in Connecticut. Colin, who is the New York Mets and Stony Brook play-by public address announcer. And Jared, who's a lawyer over at ESPN. Keith Jackson in the middle, and Dandy Don Meredith. Football becomes entertainment with Monday Night Football because of the banter between the city slicker Cosell and the Dandaroo Don Meredith. And football is accelerating. By the 1970s, it's a business. Television contracts give teams more money than they ever thought possible. The World Football League comes into existence. Its challenge leads the NFL to expand into Seattle and Tampa. The Players Association and the NFL owners go to war in the mid-1970s over contracts. 1980, football pays. There's me in the middle. Again, Fortune magazine, I'm interviewing Harvey Meyerson, who was the United States Football League attorney, and now there are plans to bring back the USFL 36 years after its demise. There were strikes. There was the USFL. There was the USFL NFL antitrust case, the 1987 players' strike. But through it all, the game's popularity skyrockets. Pete Rozelle is tossed out as commissioner, although he said he retired in 1987. Paul Tagliabue comes in, and they are talking about, well, they're not talking, they're talking money. Rupert Murdoch comes in and enriches the owners and players because he's rolling the dice to get his Fox network going. Yeah, he's got The Simpsons, he's got Gary Shandling, he's got a couple other things, Married with Children, but he lands the NFL, and that legitimizes Fox as a network. The NFL becomes a political force in Arizona, threatening to pull the Super Bowl out of Arizona in 1993, unless in 1990, Arizona voters say yes to a Martin Luther King Day. They don't. But in 1992, it comes up before the voters again. They do. The game in 1993 was sent to Pasadena, California. And they say yes, and the NFL rewards or awards Arizona a Super Bowl in 1996. Franchise movement. Cleveland Browns. Art Modell takes his team to Baltimore. Bud Adams takes his Houston Oilers team to Nashville. Georgia Franiani takes her Anaheim Rams, Los Angeles Rams, to St. Louis. And Al Davis leaves the Los Angeles area and goes back up to the Bay Area in Oakland and restores the Oakland Raiders. And now brain injuries. Brain injuries seem to have gone away. Well, they never went away, but the publicity on brain injuries went away. But they're coming back. Football does. There are a lot of former players who are mentally disabled because of so many shots to the head that they really can't function. And a number of players have committed suicide. Colin Kaepernick took a knee in 2016, played with San Francisco in 2016, and has not been seen since then. 21st century, well-oiled machine. Concussions are a problem. The NFL and Colin Kaepernick, who still has not really gotten a shot 5 years after he last, or actually almost 5 years since he last played with San Francisco 49ers. Last year, after the George Floyd protests, the NFL, Roger Goodell said Black Lives Mattered, and they owed Colin Kaepernick an apology for not listening to his protests back in 2016. And that's me surviving an Oakland Raiders party back in New Jersey with Sandra Fortunato, back in the mid-1990s down in Tom's Rivers, Phil Filippiano, and Big Ben Davidson. I survived. Anyway, Vet, thank you for inviting me. Any questions, any comments? Feel free. Now's the time.
Thank you so much. Fascinating history. And just jam-packed. That was fascinating.
I lived some of it. Any questions or comments?
I don't, it's hard, can't see anyone, but anyone can unmute if they have a question or use the raise their hand.
Comment. Because that's just the thimble. I didn't give the rest of the Super Bowl story is an amazing story because it involves the first massive boycott in the history of sports, which was the 1965 New Orleans All-Star game by the American Football League, and the 22 African-American players who went there who did not get cab rides from the airport to the New Orleans, because in the Jim Crow days, even though the civil rights movement was over, the only way a black person could get a cab is if a white person went with him or her in the cab and vouched for the guy. And there were threats on the lives of players. Players were called names, and this all happened over a 36-hour period. And the black players said, "We're out of here." And the game was rescheduled for Houston. And New Orleans didn't get an American Football League team and was too toxic. And New Orleans would become the centerpiece of the negotiations between the NFL, AFL, and Congress for the merger, because it violated antitrust laws.
What is this?
I have the needle.
Yeah, and so
No, this is not usual.
That's a whole other talk for another day.
That's by mistake, but someone's unmuted. I don't know if they had a question or that was just a mistake. Oh, it must have been a mistake. They're muted again.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much.